Welcome back to the channel. It's Big Chris. I've still got that big receding hairline, and in today's video we're talking about the cheddar, we're talking about the wonga, the moolah, the dough. What are we talking about? We're talking about money. Money. It makes the world go round. But I've got 3 questions for you. The first one is, why don't people just simply trade? Why do we use money? The second one is, why do we have different types of money? Now, this is a coin and these are pieces of paper. Why is the paper worth more than the coin? And the third one is, why do we universally accept that these pieces of paper and this coin have value? Now, if you look at that piece there, that's a 20, and that one there, that is a 5. Who made it so that that 20 is worth more than that 5? Well, guess what? We're all going to find out together, because this is the history of money. Money is very old. In fact, most historians believe that money is older than the written language. So when it comes to pinpointing a specific date or a specific location, that's basically impossible. We can't do it. What we do theorize is that it probably started when people started living together in the first civilizations. So we're talking about Mesopotamia. We're talking about the Indus Valley. We're talking about China. We're also maybe potentially talking about the ancient Maya of the Americas. But what we do know is that when people started to live together en masse and create these very first city-states, it was then that money would have probably been invented. So back in these ancient times, people were trading. They were bartering with different goods. And I'll give you a few examples. So if you want to trade an apple with a pear, well, that's quite an easy deal, because both of them are relatively small. They're both edible and they're both fruits. So everybody gets a good deal. Equally, if you have a fork and a spade, they're both agricultural tools, so both people get a good deal. But here's the problem. What if you only have apples, but you want to buy a spade? Then what happens? How many apples do you need to purchase that spade? Well, that's the ultimate question. Is it 10? Is it 20? Is it 30 apples? Well, who actually knows? So what we need is a third item that is going to be able to make that deal happen. But hold on. At this part of the story, that third item isn't money. The third item is actually shells, it's stones, it's actually even little carvings, it's all these various different items. Now, what we do know, they weren't using coins, they weren't using any kind of precious metals. What they were using were readily available items that they could all get their hands on, hence why we have the shells. So within these small communities, it was accepted that shells, stones, and all these items were currency. Now, by the time we get to the 7th century BC, this is actually when we start to see the very first coins that are being manufactured. These come in the Aegean Sea and the Greek islands. We also see in India and also in China. Now, these civilizations are actually hundreds, maybe thousands of miles apart. And yet what they're all doing is creating coins. They're all slightly different. Some of them are square, some of them are circle, some of them are whole, some of them have got circles in them. But the one thing that they all have in common is that all of these civilizations needed that third item, and they chose the coin. Also, during the 7th century BC, we now have to introduce a kingdom known as Lydia. Now, Lydia is in ancient Turkey, and we have to introduce it because they are very important to our money story. Because back then, they started carving away at pieces of metal, and they were creating coins that are the direct descendants to the coins that we use today. So let me explain. So back then, they started to create sphere-like coins, just like this one. On one side of the coin, it would have the monarch or the leader of the country. On the reverse side, it would often have some kind of national symbol, maybe a coat of arms, maybe a wild animal that was famous in that country. But what we do know is that the coins that they were making thousands of years ago are the direct descendants to coins we use today. Now, how did all of these coins spread around the known world? Well, we have to thank the Greeks, the Macedonians, and the Romans, because where Lydia stands, which is in modern day Turkey, that is the crossroads between Europe and Asia. So anything that was created within this region would often get picked up by these larger empires afterwards. And of course, they would think that that was a great idea. They liked the idea of these nice coins, so they would use them and circulate them around their kingdoms, meaning that all of Europe, Asia, Africa, and even the Far East would start to see these brand new coins in their countries. We're now at the part of the story where this comes into play. Paper money. Now we have to go all the way to China during the 7th century, and back then they were known as the Tang dynasty. Now the Tang, they were quite a large country, and some of their ports were some of the biggest in the world. Now if you can imagine when one of these large container ships pulls into port and they want to sell all of their goods, now you'd have to be a pretty strong guy to start lugging all of your tons and tons of money down to the port to trade with these ships. So people decided to make it more simplistic. Instead of having strong men carrying big bags of money, they decided that paper money or paper receipts were going to be the best answer. So if you want to buy from the ships, you would often write the amount, hand it over to the people on the ship, and they would accept it as currency. Now, these pieces of paper had a positive and a negative. The positive was that within the trading community and within all these Chinese ports, everybody accepted that the paper was currency. But the problem is that if you were to move away from these coastal ports and you went into the interior cities, if you turned up to a shop and handed them a piece of paper saying that this is worth money, they would probably laugh in your face because they'd never seen it before. But 400 years later, during the Song dynasty in the 11th century, they decided to nationalise paper money and make it so that everybody could accept it wherever you were. But wait 1 minute. Now that paper money has been nationalised, what's stopping you, me, and everybody else from simply printing our own paper money and handing it out as if it's the real deal? Well, in fact, there wasn't anything stopping us, and that's what a lot of people did. They started printing their own money and giving it away. So what happens is the Chinese economy tanks. Why? Because there's too much fake money in the economy. So what happens is that the government, they come together and they create what we know as the gold standard. The gold standard means that for every banknote that is created, there is the same amount of gold that is kept by the national government. By the time we get to the 13th century, paper money is now flowing its way into Europe. And one of the reasons for this is because European explorers such as Marco Polo and William Roebuck have been exploring in China. And they've noticed that people are trading not with coins, not with goods, but with paper money, which is so bizarre to people like Marco Polo and William Roebuck. So what they do is they come back to Europe and they start telling people about this paper money. And people start to think, actually, that seems like a pretty good idea. I'm not that strong. I can't carry that much money. So paper, yeah, I really like that idea. Now, as we get into the 1600s, we start to see people create a new position. And this position is the goldsmith. So the goldsmiths are old merchants, traders, people that used to work at these large ports. These were individuals that were very good at dealing with large amounts of money. And they would often have a safe or some kind of vault, maybe at home, maybe at work. But they were excellent when it came to looking after large amounts of money. And they were seen as what we would call the first banks. So if you had a large amount of money and you didn't know what to do with it, you would take it to a goldsmith and they would look after it for you. But there were a positive and a negative. The first one is it was probably the best you could get. It was the safest by far. But the negative was that what if your money just poof disappeared? It wasn't like you had any insurance. People back in the 1600s would often give their money and just hope and pray that the goldsmith would still have the money when they came back. And if they didn't, well, good luck. Throughout the 1600s, there seemed to be this glaring problem that people found when it came to spending paper money. So we know that coins were a lot more simplistic when it came to spending. You could simply take a coin, take it to a restaurant or a shop or a theatre, hand over the coin and people would accept it because it's a physical coin. It usually weighs however much it's worth. So that's quite simple. But what if you're a restaurant owner and somebody walks in with a piece of paper and they tell you that that's worth £20? Are you going to believe them? Well, this is the problem that we start to see. So I'll give you an example. Imagine that you take £20 coins and you distribute them in a goldsmith's in London. And in return, they give you a piece of paper that says that that is now worth £20. Now, it's okay whilst you're in London because most people will know the goldsmith and they will know that that is a reputable person. But here's the thing. What happens if you travel to a different city, maybe Birmingham, and you get to Birmingham and you have your London-based banknote? Well, maybe people in Birmingham might look at that and think, no, I'm not going to accept that piece of paper because one, I don't know who the goldsmith is. Two, I don't know if I should trust them. And also, unless you can give me some kind of guarantee, some kind of insurance, why should I trust you? Receiving paper money that was made or created in a different town is often risky, and it comes in two parts. Sometimes you might have to look at the logistics of how much it's going to cost you to go to the goldsmith to retrieve your money. And in most cases, if it was a long distance, most people would just flat out refuse to take your money. I'll give you an example. If the goldsmith is in London, but you try to use your receipt or your banknote in Manchester, well, the person who receives it in Manchester, they would have to take that piece of money, they would have to go all the way back to London to the goldsmith to retrieve their money and then travel all the way back to where they came from. So not only do they have to take the £20 that you're offering them, but in some respects, you might have to pay them a little bit more simply to do the journey to pick up the money that's in your goldsmith's hands. Throughout Europe, many countries recognise this problem when it comes to spending money in various locations. So what we start to see in the early 1620s is the very first European banks. And these are nationwide. And these are a few on the screen right now. And as we get to the 1690s, 1694 in particular, this is where we get the largest one, which is the Bank of England. From now on, it is the Bank of England's sole responsibility to create banknotes that are going to be accepted everywhere. Throughout the 1800s, Britain becomes the sole superpower of the world, and its economy is the largest the world has ever seen. And what this means is that the British pound sterling becomes the anchor for all currency around the world. So what do I mean? Well, one British pound is the equivalent to $4.87 over in the United States. And all these currencies that you see on the board are the exact same as one British pound. So the pound becomes the standard that all world rates are set at. By the time the world gets into the 1900s, all the major powers are using the gold standard. And this is good for now, but over the next 30 years, it's going to change because we have the First World War and then we have the Great Depression. And by the time we get to the 1930s, all them great powers, well, their economies have crumbled. They are in so much debt that their economies are crippled. So when we look at the gold standard, it becomes pointless because if this is the amount of gold you have in your reserve, but this is the amount of debt that you have, well, as you can see, it doesn't really add up. So a lot of these major powers decide to abandon the gold standard. As we move away from the horrors of the Second World War into the 1950s and 1960s, we start to see the decline of the British Empire. And because of this, we then start to see the emergence of two superpowers. We have the United States and the Soviet Union. The United States goes on to become one of the great trading nations of the world. And in fact, a lot of countries that used to use the British pound, such as Canada, Australia and New Zealand, well, they're trading so much with America that they decide to adopt a type of dollar as their national currency. Hence why we see the Canadian dollar, the Australian dollar and the New Zealand dollar, because it makes it far easier to trade dollar for dollar as opposed to dollar for sterling. And what we see is that the sterling drops off from being the anchor of the world currency and it is replaced by the US dollar. So to finish our story, we now have to talk about these. These are bank cards. So instead of using coins and paper money, we're now using plastic. And these were first introduced in the 1970s in both Britain and America. So what happens is that you make a purchase, you swipe the card using the bar at the top, and to make the transaction complete, you sign your name. As we then get into the 2000s, we are introduced to chip and pin. This is where you use a 4-digit pin to make sure that your transactions are safe. Then, as we get into the late 2000s, we are then introduced to contactless. Now, I don't know whether this is safer or not. It can be, it can't be. But if you've ever been on a shopping spree or you've ever been on a night out where you're drinking and you just keep tapping that card, well, the next day when you see the bill, my God, it can horrify you. So I don't know whether contactless is safer. They tell us it is, but I'll let you make up your mind. So there we are, everybody. That is the history of money. So I want to thank you all for watching the video. And once again, I'm Big Chris. I've still got that big receding hairline as always. And I want to wish you all a fantastic day.